All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I'm really pleased to be participating in the Network for Landscape Conservation Action webinar series. Today's webinar is obviously hosted by the network and by the Yellowstone-to-Yukon Conservation Initiative. I want to tell you a little bit about NLC, the Network for Landscape Conservation. It is a national umbrella group and a leading voice on collaborative landscape conservation. It seeks to connect people to the ideas and innovations around large landscape conservation so that we can share and learn from one another. It's also a community organization, basically seeking to connect all of the collaborative large landscape efforts interested in engaging. For Y2Y, it's a really important venue. It offers an ability for us to pull together and do really important science that will benefit us all. It also offers us an opportunity to push forward those larger enabling type policies that support large landscape conservation to go forward. I would argue that right now is the time for large landscape conservation. We've got 55 countries, including the United States and Canada, who are committed to conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030. What better way to do it than large landscape conservation? So with no further ado, I'm going to get going. I want to start off, if you've never seen this website, it's called Native Land. And I wanted to put in the chat my land acknowledgement, but I can't get to my chat right now, but please think about and honor where you're from. The Y2Y region has 75 different territories of Indigenous peoples. I'm currently talking from Canmore, which is on the land of the Blackfeet, Stoney, Tsuut'ina, and Ktunaxa peoples. So today I'm going to talk about not Y2Y, the organization, but rather Y2Y, the vision. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned, what's progressed over the last number of years, and what we have yet to work on. So I'll tell you a little bit about who Y2Y is. I'm going to provide a little bit of a global perspective of what's happening in the world and why large landscape conservation is so important. Some of the things that are advancing across Y2Y, how it's working, challenges and opportunities. So let me first start off by just centering you around where Y2Y is. Y2Y is one of the most intact mountain ecosystems left in the world, but it's being increasingly chiseled away, if you will. So Y2Y is a vision about an interconnected system of wildlands and waters that stretch all the way from Wyoming all the way up to the Arctic Circle. And it's about harmonizing the needs of people with those of nature. There's an organization that I come from. I'm the president and chief scientist of the Yellowstone-to-Yukon Conservation Initiative. We're sort of the vision keepers. We're the organization that's dedicated to helping secure this region, but we don't do it alone. The vision is about the 450 partners who are all working on different elements and many others who are working on elements who aren't official partners. Two of the principles behind Y2Y, the organization, are science and knowledge and a collaborative approach. This has been, these are two of the tenets that have been around since the very inception of the vision. And it's about working across local, regional, national, and global scales. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. But first, let's go back to the global picture. If you go to Belize or somewhere in Africa or anywhere else in the world and you step into a protected area, there is a global definition. You know it's a protected area and everybody agrees on what has to be maintained in order for it to be a protected area. It has to work to protect biodiversity. And this has been one of the early approaches to conserving biodiversity. And in fact, In the early 1900s, there were a few protected areas. You can see Banff and Yellowstone, for example, on this map, but we really weren't concerned about conserving biodiversity. We started to want to protect some more important areas. You see down in Eastern Africa, there's some green showing up. There's really nothing in the marine world yet. We're seeing more protected areas happen by the 1960s. This is when Rachel Carson's book came out, and we see a lot of increase of protected areas around the world. It really is a positive story of hope, and we're starting by the early 2000s to actually see that the marine world needs protection too. And that gets us to today. So this is a story of hope. Are we done yet? Absolutely not. We're still seeing that we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. So what do people say about it? Well, one of the things that we now know from a science perspective is that if protected areas are isolated, that they're not going to function as well. So we need a couple of things. People like E.O. Wilson would tell you that we need about half is what the scientific studies show of every ecosystem if it's to maintain its function and all of the species within it. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more, but in the Y2Y region, there's been a lot of progress. This one I think is particularly exciting, where a number of partner groups worked for years and years and years to get an area the size of Nova Scotia into a conservation agreement. And those protected areas are currently being designated. In addition to protected areas, we know from science that we need to connect those protected areas. I really love this sign, 185-kilometer wide corridor for lots of different species. It says it all. The people driving understand what that means. Yet, when we talk about connectivity, it's always been a relatively fuzzy term. Is it for whales? What does it mean for butterflies? What does it mean for fish and for birds? And is it really about connectivity of freshwater areas? Or is it really about just migrations of species in and out of parks? Or do we need to think about connectivity from a climate change lens, given that we know that because climate change is happening, that species are moving in time and space? Well, whatever it is, the world has grasped onto the concept. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development created a call to action for landscape connectivity. And I want to just read off a few of the companies that you'll recognize the names of that are part of this movement, that recognize this need for business. Toyota, IBM, Hitachi, Nissan, many companies are part of this call to action. We can look at leading countries in the world that often that are tourist-based that recognize that the best thing that they can do for their economy is actually create connected, protected areas. So Costa Rica is about 25% protected. They've done a lot of restoration work to ensure that these protected areas aren't isolated, but are actually operating in an ecological network of corridors and protected areas. My favorite is possibly Bhutan, which is more than 50% protected. And again, the colorful areas are protected areas, and the green areas are those corridors that they also designated. And they did this when they still had a king who believed that gross national happiness was really important, and that conservation of nature was part of that happiness index. If only we could all be so fortunate. So given that there's been a lot of confusion about the idea of conserving connectivity, 150 different people from every continent except for Antarctica worked for a lot of years to come up with globally agreed upon guidelines for ecological networks and ecological corridors. And this document's available online. And it's really important because it sort of says, if you want to conserve ecological corridors, these are the things that you need to do to get there. So if you're not aware of that, I just wanted to point out that that is a good guide for those of you who are interested in connectivity conservation. But I'm going to dive into Y2Y now. So we have this global context where we know protected areas are important, but we need to do more. So what can we do within a large landscape, and why would we even think about large landscape conservation? Well, the story of Y to Y is that in the early 90s, there was a recognition that transboundary conservation between the US and Canada wasn't really happening. The US groups weren't talking to the Canadian groups. And at the same time, the ecologists had this new technology like GPS collars. And so they were able to track movements of animals like Pluie. And Pluie did a 100,000-kilometer jaunt in just a few years between 2 countries, 3 states, 2 provinces, and 30 different jurisdictions on public lands, private lands, Native American reservations, First Nation reserves, and much, much more. And then just south of Kootenay National Park, she and her pups were legally hunted. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there just, I think 2 weeks ago, Wolf 2001 made an enormous jaunt from Banff National Park, where he was collared all the way down to northwestern Montana, where again, it was legally harvested. And I think one of the things that's hopeful that we learned from 2001 is that even though the landscape is much more developed than it was in the early 90s, these kinds of movements are still possible, and our goal is to ensure that they can continue. So other things that the early founders of the Y2Y vision realized is that large mammals, so the hooved animals and the large carnivores, were literally disappearing across North America. On the left-hand side, you can see the historic range. The brighter colors mean more animals. And what you see in the current is that those animals' ranges have really shrunk, and Y2Y is one of the last places where these animals still exist. We can look at specific species like grizzly bears. So at one point in time, we had more than 100,000 grizzly bears, and they were all the way down into Mexico. But by the 1920s, in the lower 48 states, they were largely relegated to small, isolated populations. We all know what happens when you have a small, isolated population. Eventually, maybe one gets shot, or maybe there's just no more females. And eventually that population goes extinct. They all went extinct except for that one red dot, which is Yellowstone National Park. And you can literally see that Y2Y region heading up from there. So another reason, and the founders of Y2Y sort of realized this, is that Y2Y at its very vision is a response to climate change. I won't ask any of you where you are on this scientific scale, but what climate change scientists suggest is that we need to have more, expanded protected areas. We need to connect the protected areas, and we need to reduce stressors, all of which are part of that Y2Y vision. Okay. So we've got this vision of connecting and protecting the region. How do we actually do it? What actually happens? So I'm going to talk about a very specific example of a collaborative of 60 different partners on the BC, Idaho, Montana border. Oh, wait, let me back up for a sec. I just missed my own slide. So the first thing we have to think about is science, right? We have to have information at the scale of Y2Y that tells us where it's important to work. So I'm going to give you one example of the kind of science that helps us, and I'll dive into some other examples. So research from the University of Montana shows that grizzly bears are often a good umbrella species. That means if we get it right for grizzly bears, we get it right for a lot of the other critters. And so in the example I'm going to show you shortly, we actually used grizzly bears to prioritize some of the places that we needed to get work done that are important at the scale of Y2Y. The second thing that we really need is we all need to play in the sandbox together. We need to collaborate. So this Cabinet Purcell Mountain Corridor Collaborative on the BC, Idaho, and Montana border involved more than 60 different partners. It still does today. So I'll show you this area here. And what you can see is that a once continuous population of grizzly bears is now isolated. These yellow lines indicate isolated populations of grizzly bears that were once connected. So we're literally seeing the fracture zone of grizzly bears on the US-Montana border. This is not a good thing for the Y2Y mission to be a success. So what do we do about it? Well, these groups got together and created a larger vision for this region that matters again at the Y2Y scale. One of the first things we had to do was commission some science, so Michael Proctor and others, to tell us where are the places where we could reconnect these currently isolated populations. And so this is a science map. These yellow areas or hotter areas show these areas of connectivity. I'll point, this yellow line right here into the Idaho Panhandle is a really important region. And it's one of the regions that we worked on a connectivity project with a bunch of partners. So from that map, we chose to work on 3 areas: the Duck Lake linkage, the Kidd Creek linkage, and the Highway 2 Yak linkage right here. What's really, really cool about this is that together with lots of different groups, we were able to purchase lands, do some coexistence and some restoration work. And I'll point out this right here on the Idaho BC border, we also did a restoration project here that's not on this map. And lo and behold, Proctor et al. Science shows years later that the grizzly bears are reconnecting in those places. That's cool. So how did we get this work done? Together with $140 million, we bought 188,000 acres of private lands. Those are those critical, very small pieces of land that sometimes don't look like great places for wildlife, but they're the only place left to get wildlife from one high elevation protected area to another across private lands. So in doing so, we secured 3 wildlife corridors, 1 in Montana and 2 in British Columbia, largely. We restored that trans-boundary corridor on the Idaho-Canadian border, and we did a lot of coexistence work, right? And remember, the we is 60 different partners all coming together to play in the sandbox for the same purpose. And there were also other efforts like securing core habitat, I think about 500,000 acres and other pieces. One of the other really neat things that happened, they were supplementing a grizzly bear population that was known to be inbred with 1 individual per year, but also we had to keep those grizzly bears alive. So the group really focused on that work with coexistence. There were about 10 grizzly bears in 1990, and there's about 60 today, just in the US Cabinet Yak region, that very small population. And we know that individuals from the Selkirks and that small population have been dispersing and have gotten all the way down into the Salmon Selway today. This is progress. Okay, so that Cabinet Purcell corridor collaborative is an example of how localized work that's prioritized in the large landscape contributes to a large landscape vision and progress. So I'm going to now talk at the Y2Y scale. Like what actually has happened because there is a vision. And this gets us into a little bit of geeky science. So I'm going to just tell you the 3 things that we looked at to try and answer the question, does the vision matter? 1, we compared rates of protected area gains in the Y2Y region with other places. Did Y2Y's vision compel more protected areas to happen or not? Number 2, we documented private lands conservation and road crossing structure expansion, okay? Because we know that's a real limiting factor for connectivity. And number 3, we tested for mainstreaming of the Y2Y vision. Do people understand? Are they inspired by Y2Y? How would we know if it actually is making a difference? So this is where I said we're using science. So what we did was we tried to have a control and then somewhat of a treatment replication in order to demonstrate or show whether or not this vision has an impact. And the reason this is really important is because a lot of people say, well, it's a great vision, but does it really get anything done? So we wanted to answer that question. So this is a little bit of a geeky graph, but what it shows is the rate of protected area growth pre the Y-to-Y vision, which is shown by the red line, and post the Y-to-Y vision. And you can actually visually see that it's significantly different. Protected area increase is shown by the steepness of that line. And the line is a lot steeper post 1993. So in fact, we know that we've seen at least a 50% increase in protected areas in 25 years. And this map shows the dark green additions like the Boulder White Clouds, the Nahanni, the Rocky Mountain Front Range, and many other protected areas. And we also know that the rate of growth is expected to continue for a few years because there's 14 million new acres of committed Indigenous-led protected areas that aren't on this map. That means that the federal government, the regional government, and First Nations have agreed to these protected areas, but they're not drawn yet. So I showed you a map earlier of the Peel. That's going to be the size of Nova Scotia. The Peace River area is about restoration of endangered mountain caribou, and the Kotmuk area down here in southeastern British Columbia. So there's promise of continued progress. This is important. I'm also really hopeful, just as a side note, that the US now is really committing to engagement with First Nations. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see things like on the Rocky Mountain Front, Badger 2 medicine move forward as with Indigenous-led conservation and other movements, other efforts too. Okay, so I think you got the point. Protected areas are increasing across Y-to-Y, but is it really different than anywhere else? So we tried to do this. So we looked at all of the jurisdictions in which Y-to-Y sits. We cut the Y-to-Y region out and we said, what is the rate of growth of protected areas in those places in Montana, Alberta, Northwest Territories? And it's only about 25% growth, so about half. And I will note that a lot of that growth is due to a large landscape effort called the Great Bear Rainforest that many of you might have heard of in British Columbia. So that actually reconfirms the importance of a large landscape vision. Okay, so the third thing we looked at was the percent of protected area growth in North America. So I want you to look at this red line here. And what you see is that it's actually not a very steep line. And some would even say it was decreasing in recent years. And you can compare it to the protected areas in the regions that Y-to-Y sits, but not including Y-to-Y. And then you can compare it to Y-to-Y. And so basically what I'm trying to show you is that the Y-to-Y vision, we think, was a major contributor to the outstanding growth of protected areas. All right, so let's go to the second issue, which is the documenting of private lands conservation, as well as road crossing structures work. So here is where I'm going to diverge from the vision just to the organization Y-to-Y-CI. And the reason I'm doing this is because conservation easements are really hard to evaluate. Many conservation easements are things like agricultural easements that aren't contributing to the Y-to-Y vision. And also in Canada, there is no centralized database, so it's really hard to look at just all of them. So we looked at those that the organization helped to financially support, and that was more than 490,000 acres of private land that we advanced that were either buffers or mostly corridors that we felt were really important to advance the Y-to-Y vision, again, at that major scale, small pieces of property that matter at the Y-to-Y scale. So that's a lot of progress. And I will say that that doesn't include all of the good work that many of our land trust partners are continuing to do. Y-to-Y, not Y-to-Y, but Y-to-Y, the vision, has a lot of wildlife crossing structures. In the region, there are more than 117 dedicated underpasses or wildlife overpasses, like shown in this picture, that contribute to wildlife getting safely across roads, and incidentally also humans not hitting them and landing, having moose land in their laps. We also have more than a dozen that are committed by various governments at this point, which we're continuing to nudge forward. And the we is not just Y2Y, the organization, but many of our partners. It's really exciting. Are we done yet? Absolutely not. But are we making clear progress? Yes. I want to show you some of these crossing structures. This is one in Banff that gets heavily used. And I also wanted to point out that in Banff, which is the most well-studied set of crossing structures in the world, there are more than 40 of them in the Banff region. They've been studied for the long term. They've seen things like it took animals a long time to learn to use them. So there was a curve of increased use for many, many years. We also, because that we were fortunate enough to have overpasses and underpasses put in, this paper by Mike Sawaya and partners showed that females with cubs are only going to use overpasses, whereas males will use underpasses. And so if we wanted to have demographic connectivity, if we want females to be able to share their genetics across the road, we had to have overpasses. This is a really important finding, and it has implications for other work. There's also on the US side, arguably the most progressive set of wildlife crossing structures in the United States is on the Flathead Indian Reservation. This is their overpass just north of Missoula, Montana. And in the very southern part of the Y2Y region is the path of the pronghorn and the overpasses right outside of Pinedale. Again, really neat, very different looking because obviously there are no trees in this region. And overall, I wanted to emphasize not only that there are overpasses and underpasses, but also for them to work, you actually need the fencing that keeps wildlife off the roads and ultimately funnels wildlife onto these overpasses and into the underpasses. All right, so the last thing that we looked at was a test of the mainstreaming evidence. So is the Y2Y vision catching in other places? Again, a very hard thing to measure, and here's how we went about doing it. The first thing that we looked at was, is science, is there science about Y2Y? Is science referencing Y2Y? And today there are more than 100 peer-reviewed papers that are fully about or reference Y2Y, and the Ruth DeFries paper is just one example of that. There are also books dedicated to Y2Y and chapters in books and lots of other references. And I just chose the 100 peer-reviewed papers as one example. So we know that folks are watching it and they're also studying it, which is, by the way, very helpful for us because those of us who are working in the region can then benefit from that research. The second thing is we looked at, is our story getting out? So I'll highlight a few of these, but this is in the West Wing show. They had the Yellowstone-to-Yukon. This is in Grey's Anatomy. This is the West Wing show. National Geographic did an entire magazine dedicated to Yellowstone-to-Yukon and so forth. So I'll go through a little bit. If you're interested in Pluie the wolf, I don't think I have time to actually show you the video, but for those of you who are scientists, you'll watch it and you'll just cringe because you know what? They show a palm tree in the Y2Y region. I don't know where they're from, but I've never seen a palm tree here. And they didn't get all of the facts right, but what they did was they mainstreamed the idea of that wolf Pluie, who I talked about earlier, and her incredible trek around a big chunk of the Y2Y region. And they profiled it at a level that we as conservationists, especially as small groups of conservationists, could never have done. Likewise, there's a pretty amazing award-winning film called Wildways, and they looked at connectivity and large landscape conservation in Eastern Africa and in the Y2Y region. And again, we know that this has had an impact on people being interested, and I still get calls. They still re-show it on PBS on occasion. I got a call from my dad's friend who said, I was watching this show and I think it's about your organization. And it just cracked me up. But it's promoting this, using Y to promote this idea that large landscape conservation is critical for these large ranging species. And then we also looked at, is it shifting the paradigm from protected area conservation, which we know is important, but not quite adequate, to large landscape conservation. And so I remember being at the World Conservation Congress, and I was taking an airporter to the meeting, and I just happened to be next to somebody else who was going to the meeting. And she said, "You're from Y to Y? I'm from B to B. We want to be the marine equivalent of Y to Y." Another example is Alps to Atherton, which is now called the Great Eastern Ranges Corridor in Australia, seeking actual advice from Y to Y on how to create that corridor, and certainly inspired by Y to Y. And there are a number of other really great examples around the world. And I think the Network for Landscape Conservation is trying to get out all sorts of different models and examples at a much larger scale beyond certainly Y to Y, so that we can all learn from each other and be inspired and try new things that will really significantly advance both landscape and seascape conservation. Okay, well, so we've got this incredible context of 30 by 30. And the US and Canada both committing to trying to protect 30% of land and water by 2030. And why is it important? Certainly in the Y to Y region, we can say that we're not entirely successful. We've got some indicators that some things are going the right direction. We've still got huge challenges. One of them, I kind of refer to mountain caribou as the canary in the coal mine. It's a really sad story right now. If you look at the map on the left, all those circled with red are really at-risk populations. The one that used to go into the US actually disappeared just a few years ago, and the one further north also didn't. There were no, the possibility of breeding wasn't possible, and so they've captured them and are working on captive breeding with a hope of restoring them in the future. They're not doing well. We have one exception. I showed you earlier in the Peace River region, an indigenous-led protected area movement called the Caribou Agreement is moving forward. Just in the last 3 years, they started with 60 caribou, and they're up to officially 101 today. And so there's hope for the future for that to succeed, and it is the model of the only successful model of restoring caribou. They have a lot of land restoration to do, a lot of roads that have to be removed, and a lot of protection. This is a set of communities where the small children are going out and collecting lichen for these caribou to be in a maternal pen during the time when most of the calves would otherwise die. So it's a hands-on engagement because culturally they have a really strong connection to caribou. Other kinds of problems, there are a number of places where we have gaps. The gap is the greatest in the United States, where Yellowstone really still, for the most part, is operating as an island. So for example, grizzly bears are not connected between Yellowstone and their northern brethren. Why is that a problem? Well, it's not a problem at the moment, but grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have a lower diversity or lower genetic diversity, right? So that's going to be a problem in the longer term unless we get them reconnected. I think what's exciting is we, meaning a lot of partners who work across the Y to Y region, have been working on securing connectivity between that region. And that's a lot of different things that have to go into play. That's working with private landowners on conserving lands, not having them be developed. That's a particularly challenging issue at this time because not only was growth pre-COVID of human populations and sort of expansive growth, meaning taking up a lot of land happening, but right after COVID, we had identified several properties that we were working on with a land trust. 3 of them were bought up within a month of COVID happening, people just looking to get out of those big cities. So this is a continuing issue. Are any but these people bad people? No, they don't know that they're buying in the middle of a corridor. But we have a really time limited opportunity to secure the corridor and ensure that there is landscape level connectivity between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and also the largest wilderness complex in central Idaho. So those are examples of the kind of work that have to continue to go forward. So why is keeping the Y2Y region connected important? Well, we know it's important for, for connecting animals and plants. We also know that during this time of climate change, we have 2 climate change refugia in the Y2Y region. And we also know from science that being able to move north-south, being able to move up different slopes and different aspects is going to be really critical for a lot of different species to survive during this human-induced climate change time. And that also contributes to maintenance of ecosystems, right? If we want ecosystems to be functional, all of their elements have to be continue to be in existence. And it's important to people. It might be important to tourists. It might be important to Indigenous peoples as part of their culture. It might be important to local communities where they gain their livelihoods, and for many, many other reasons. I think from my perspective, the working together in collaboration and using science that helps us to figure out where in the Y2Y landscape is most important for that large scale vision, and then working with their local partners is the recipe for continuing to advance that vision. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. So that's just a snapshot of where Y2Y is. It's also, I hope, can be a model for how both countries seek to move forward in the 21st century to actually get to better biodiversity conservation as we think about and advance 30 by 30. So I will end there. I think, unfortunately, I don't get to see you all, but maybe Laramie, who is also on the screen with me from the Network for Landscape Conservation, can read a question, and I'd be happy to engage in that way.
Thanks, Jodi. That was fabulous. We do have a couple questions in the chat, and I just encourage anyone to either use the Q&A function or the chat. So our first question is, how are the financial needs and developing funding sources addressed? Is it up to partners? What's the impact of the Y2Y vision on obtaining funding?
That's a great question. So in the first 20 years of Y2Y, we believe that vision and also the entity, the Y2Y CI, but also the partners work together. We know that vision brought $50 million to the region. That's not through the very small organization, Yellowstone-to-Yukon Conservation Initiative necessarily. That's funders to the region, creating something where funders said, yeah, that's ambitious and it's doable, and so we want to fund there. So there are a number of foundations, for example, that have focal areas, and it's in part because of that Y2Y vision. But it is always a struggle. We, the conservation community, never have all the resources that we feel we need.
And our second question is from Ernest Cook, and he asks, how does Y2Y inform the goal of 30 by 30?
Thank you, Ernest. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's our hope that Y2Y can inform the goal by helping both countries think about not individual protected areas, but how protected areas need to function in a larger landscape context, and how that work needs to get done. To us, while we work on enabling policies at the international level, like the IUCN connectivity guidelines, and those are absolutely critical, and we of course are supporting 30 by 30 at both federal levels. that work has to get done at a local place. So if local communities, rights holders, and stakeholders are engaged and care about their backyards, then we think we can advance enduring conservation. Thank you.
Okay, Angie Gerst asks, wonderful to see the progress Y2Y has made. Can you speak about volunteer opportunities for people living in Vancouver?
All right, Angie. Well, there are lots of volunteer opportunities, not only with Y2Y CI, the conservation organization, but actually a lot of the different partner groups. So Y2Y CI occasionally will engage volunteers when it's safe on the ground ways. Right now, last year during the beginning of COVID, we piloted, and I think we're replicating, using people who care about social media to push forward ideas about large landscape conservation through their social media mechanisms. So there's some training involved, and one has to be comfortable putting themselves out there, but that's an example. There are also entities, and one of the groups that I'm spacing on their name, but there are entities who actually get people out and do participatory science. And some of those are pay, and some of those are because they're funding their larger research program through that sort of volunteerism base. But there are many ways. So I encourage you to look at entities that are in the region and reach out and ask that question.
How will you know when Y2Y has succeeded? What is your ultimate objective?
Oh, I love that question. My daughter said to me, "What will you do when you're done with the Y2Y vision?" And I thought, "Oh, I'll retire." And then I thought, you know what? I wish that were the case. I'm in the middle of working with partners on talking about protected area de-gazettement. That's the removal of parks and protected areas that's happened throughout time. And it's happened a lot in the Y2Y region. We're actually re-protecting areas that were previously protected. And including, like, for example, Banff National Park was a lot bigger historically than it is today. Some of that's been recovered through provincial parks. Some of it hasn't. We're still working on that. And I think that speaks to that conservation is one of those, it's a value, and it requires care and feeding to be sustained through time. I think in the ideal world, we would have a system where we know that our protected areas are connected. We're seeing species like grizzly bears and caribou connected genetically through the region. And we're seeing human communities that are thriving communities. They're not, they're living in harmony with nature, and nature in fact is helping their human well-being in those communities. So that's a very high level answer.
Mark Butler asks, and also says, sorry, large question, but any thoughts on opportunities in Eastern North America?
Oh, there's great work going on in Eastern North America. There's a group that was originally, is called Two Countries, One Forest. And there's a big project kind of within that region called Staying Connected. A great person named Jessie Levine is a good contact. So you can look her up online. She's with the Nature Conservancy. And they're doing excellent work. There's also been sort of a long-term movement called Adirondacks to Algonquin, A to A, which has been an aspirational movement. There's a lot of work right now on the Trans-Canada Highway, looking at crossing structures. And in fact, there's a recommendation to the federal government that's been advancing as a start on sort of thinking about connectivity to get it right for the entire Trans-Canada Highway. And, I think that, again, that's sort of their equivalent of an interstate. Wouldn't it be cool if the US selected the major interstates that are barriers, not just in the Y2Y region, but in other regions, and committed to ensuring that wildlife could get safely across those big interstate highways?
John Gilroy asks, can you address the question of durability of past, current, and future conservation gains over time that Y2Y has achieved and is seeking?
Yeah, I think durability is always a question, right? Because it's about cultural values, it's about where things are at. I think I'll just offer a few thoughts on it. One is, during COVID, I think not just in the Y2Y region, but people really realized how important nature is. So just in my backyard outside of Canmore is Kananaskis country with several provincial parks. We had a 200% increase in use in those parks. And so what we're actually seeing is increasing demand of nature. But beyond that, and I'll just use another Alberta example, but I think this is relevant elsewhere. The government proposed to actually delist, get rid of 37% of their provincial parks in Alberta. And I will tell you that Albertans won't stand for it. They love nature. They identify with nature as part of who they are, part of their DNA. Yes, there's a lot of natural resource extraction, but they also really value nature. And Albertans stood up, and the government 3 days before Christmas had to say, oh, well, we didn't really mean that. We're going to keep it as provincial parks. And then the provincial government opened up the 1987, I think it was 87, now I'm forgetting the dates, but early 80s ban on open pit coal mining. And Corb Lund and Katie Lang and hundreds and thousands of Albertans once again came out, and the government again had to say, oh, whoops, well, actually, we didn't really mean that. We're going to put that coal mine law back into place. And I think that it's that locally driven values that I don't think that they exist and that they're permanent through time. I think it is something that has to actively be maintained through education and experience. So are we in a good place right now in the Y2Y region? I do think we are. Is that going to be that way forever? Maybe or maybe not, but I think we have to continue to nurture that love of nature and that understanding of human dependence with natural systems.
So we've got a couple of questions here about the intersection of landscape conservation and recreation. And the first one is, do you see a role for long distance hiking trails to play with large landscape conservation initiatives? And I'll tell you this second question as well, which is kind of related, which is, Jodi, can you address the issue of growing stress on protected areas by the exponential increases in outdoor recreation? So I think just talking about that interface.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who worry about the impacts of recreation. When we look at parks like Banff or Yellowstone, I think they're great reasons. Like whenever people say they're overcrowded, I say, yeah, people love national parks. We need more. Now, the reality with the parks is that human visitation and that recreation has impacts. Most of it is within a half a mile of the road, right? And so I think understanding where and how recreation have impacts on the landscape is really important so that we can better manage those issues. There are places, for example, and again, I'm just using my backyard, but it's relevant almost anywhere. In Canmore, there are designated wildlife corridors, and we know that human use of those corridors has increased exponentially, and also the way the use is. So people are now mountain biking at night or running at night with their headlamps. And so there's less and less time and space for wildlife to constructively use those corridors. Well, that's an issue that's under discussion. How do we manage that to ensure that the wildlife corridors still also function for wildlife? I think one of the biggest issues that we're seeing in the Y2Y region is that actually there's not very much information about user-made trails, about where people are actually going and at what densities, and how that might intersect, for example, with endangered or sensitive species. And so my colleague, Dr. Erin Jacob, is working with the BC and the Alberta government and the University of Northern British Columbia to look at how we can use new technologies, like, I don't know how many of you use trail apps or some of the other apps, to begin to track in a more cheap way. Because in the olden days, it would be you'd go out and you'd count how many people would use trails using trail counters, and they're clunky and you don't get quite the spatially extensive information. But understanding how people are using the landscape and then how that relates to important areas for biodiversity or particular species, then can help us to inform where we might want to move trails or change the way we're doing recreation. But recreation is, it's sort of, I think there's many opportunities. Many of us love to recreate, and that's part of our connection with nature. And I think there is room to do that. I think, there are some states like Colorado that have figured out that the more green space that they set aside, actually the better for their economy, right? They've been able to attract, the .com industry and tech industry into Denver because there's a quality of life there. There's an ability to get outdoors there. And so I think it's a matter of ensuring that recreationists understand what their potential impacts are, how to be in nature. So, for example, if in the Y2Y region where there are grizzly bears, maybe choosing to carry bear spray instead of a gun might be a better option to manage for coexistence type issues. And so there's a lot of need for that kind of awareness, that kind of outreach to happen to the recreation community. And there's a lot of need for the recreation community to stand up and demand that we have more protected areas, because a lot of the areas that people like to use are overrun. And so maybe we need to prioritize that over some of the traditional uses that are actually earning less income. But we do have to manage it well, otherwise it can have impacts.
A couple more for you. There's a lot coming in, which is great. And
I wish it were more of a dialogue.
This one is, how does protection of water resources factor into the Y2Y vision?
Well, it's huge, right? The Y2Y region, I don't actually know where they got this number, but at one point somebody said that it's the headwaters for 15 million people. The reality is the Colorado River now gets diverted to LA, so maybe it's all of LA too, I don't know. But it is important headwaters. There's been pretty good research about where water is coming from. So, we know that if we look at, for example, overall ecosystem services, Erin, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, she and other folks mapped 3 ecosystem services. So they mapped where water is coming from, where people are recreating, and where carbon is located. And then where, not just where it is in the Y2Y and actually in all of Canada, but also then where people are benefiting from those pieces. Because if the water's heading up, say, the McKenzie River and into the Arctic Ocean, there aren't as many people that water is servicing. And so it turns out that when you look at particularly the southern part of the Y2Y region, it is the headwaters for a lot of people. And how we treat those headwaters actually impacts that water quality.
A couple more. So Mark Butler says, this maybe isn't necessarily a question to ask out loud, but I do think it's really relevant. And the question is there a link to the paper that you've been drawing from regarding the conservation achievements of Y2Y. Did you mention that, where people could locate that paper if there is one?
Well, you can send me an email, and when it gets published, so it's in submission right now, so it's not published yet, but we're desperately trying to get it out because we do think it's important for informing 30 by 30. So we're hurrying as fast as we can. If you send me an email, I'll be happy to send it to you when it gets published.
Great, thanks. And your email is right there on the slide that folks can see. So hit Jodi up for that. David Savage asks, Rotary has a bit of a comment and then a question. Rotary International has a 7th area of focus, environmental sustainability. He's the co-chair of a group in Southeast BC, North Idaho, and Eastern Washington, and glad to be collaborating with you all at Y2Y. He asked, what can we do more of for greater impact with local clubs to further the Y2Y vision?
Wow, that's a great question. Rotary is such a wonderful group. The transboundary Rotary groups have been doing this incredible thing called Hands Across the Border. And on non-COVID years, they meet at one of the border crossings and literally shake hands. And it's the intentional effort for positive peace and positive collaboration, including on conservation. And I think Rotary clubs have incredible power because they're in so many of the major population centers. And I think there are a number of things that Rotaries can do. One is making sure that people are aware of the value of nature. I know Rotary often hosts talks. And so, there are 450 groups just in the Y2Y region alone that would love to be able to offer perspectives on nature conservation. There are also, for those members who want to be more active, groups often, the way we get things done is local communities voice their interest and their support. And that means members of Rotary clubs. So it might be for, turning back the coal mining in Southeast British Columbia right now. There's a commitment of more than a dozen crossing structures. If that's of interest to you to support, it'd be great for the government to hear from you. You can work with WildSite or Y2Y or many of the other partners who really are pushing to make sure that government moves forward those really important wildlife crossing structures. So those are a few thoughts. Thank you.
So we're almost at the top of the hour here. We've got a couple minutes left, and there's one final question that's kind of a bit of a case study question that I'm gonna read to you. So this says, speaking of Colorado, the citizens of Boulder are in the final phase of a 20-year effort to protect the South Boulder Creek floodplain and watershed corridor to the Rocky Mountain Nature Center. Not only is it an established wildlife corridor, especially during wildfires, but this area is one of the last open natural areas for several native species. The local university has purchased the land and intends to build a new South Campus, which would double the size of the existing campus, all for business interests and more housing purposes. Suggestions?
Whew. Those are, that is my hometown. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. So yeah, it makes my heart throb to hear this story. I think on those kinds of issues, I think it's about the community coming together. So there needs to be a place where the community can have a voice and decide if they have a cohesive vision. And then it's about meeting with the rights holders and the stakeholders. So in this case, it sounds like the university is sort of the leading proponent of this. I would imagine that there are other businesses and perhaps government officials who have indicated whether they support this or not. But it's about engaging in that dialogue and seeing if there are ways that development could go forward that would retain the characteristics that are so important for that corridor. In worst case scenarios, there are a bunch of different conservation organizations that work in Colorado that can do sort of if it's a really big issue, it's a sort of about shaming the entity that's proposing that kind of development into doing the right thing if they're not willing to come to the negotiating table. And that kind of public shaming can really have an influence, as we've seen over and over again, on organizations that have much more funding than conservation organizations ever have. But ideally, it gets solved in a civil dialogue and agreement to talk about values and goals. That's a tough question, and it's what we face all the time in conservation. I so wish I could be talking to everyone, and I just want to say thank you for great questions and engaging, and I hope someday that we get to be in person so that we can have these kinds of conversations in a less stilted way. Thank you, Laramie. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Jodi. We'll conclude there, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks.